Gray rock, she had learned, was not coldness. It was armor. It was the quiet art of becoming so plain, so uninteresting, that a toxic man could no longer find a way in. The first time Elena used it, she did it with her chin lifted and her hands steady around a paper cup of coffee gone lukewarm under the fluorescent lights of a downtown cafe. Across from her, Derek was already performing for an audience of one, his voice low and polished, wearing that familiar look of patient disappointment like it had been tailored for him. He leaned back in the booth and smiled as if he were the reasonable one, as if he had not spent 3 years teaching her to doubt her own memory, her own instincts, her own worth. "You always take everything so personally," he said, glancing at the barista, then back at her, inviting the room to agree with him. Elena only nodded once. No defense, no explanation, no apology, just a small, unreadable look and the faintest sip of coffee. "Before we continue, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country below, and if you believe dignity is the strongest revenge, hit like and subscribe." Now, back to her story. Derek frowned, because people like him did not know what to do with silence that refused to bleed. He tapped 2 fingers against the table, waiting for the old version of her to arrive, the one who would scramble to fix the tension, smooth his ego, make herself smaller so he could feel bigger. But that woman had left 6 months ago, the night she packed one suitcase and walked out of the condominium he had always called ours when it benefited him and mine when it didn't. The rain had been thin and cold that night, and she remembered the sound her heels made on the lobby marble, each step feeling less like leaving and more like returning to herself. Now, in the cafe's soft amber light, with the smell of espresso and toasted bread in the air, she sat across from the man who had mistaken her kindness for weakness. He tried another angle, tilting his head with a half-smirk. "You're really going to sit there and pretend everything is fine?" Elena set the cup down carefully. The ceramic touched the saucer with a soft click. "I'm fine," she said, and because she gave him nothing else, the sentence landed like a closed door. He blinked just once. Around them, the cafe kept moving, a spoon against glass, quiet laughter near the window, the hiss of the milk steamer behind the counter. But at their table, the air had changed. Derek's expression tightened, not with anger, but with confusion, because she was no longer reaching for his approval like it was oxygen. That was the thing he never understood. Gray rocking was not about winning the argument. It was about removing the stage. It was about standing there, calm and unremarkable, while a manipulator slowly realized he had lost access to the version of you he used to control. Elena reached for her phone, unlocked the screen, and checked the time. 6:14 p.m. In 10 minutes, she would leave. In 20, she would be across town, meeting a lawyer who spoke in careful sentences and never once made her feel foolish for needing clarity. Derek said her name again, sharper this time, but she only looked at him with the kind of stillness that does not beg, does not flinch, does not explain. And for the first time in years, the man who had always needed a reaction from her found himself staring into a silence he could not break. By the time Elena left the cafe, the sky over downtown had turned the color of old steel, and the windows along the street were catching the last thin light of day. She walked with the same measured calm she had worn at the table, her coat closed neatly at the throat, her steps steady on the wet sidewalk. Nothing about her looked dramatic. That was the point. Derek had always expected her to arrive as an apology, a plea, or a wound he could press with one careful sentence. Instead, she moved like someone who had already made her decision and no longer needed his permission to live inside it. Her phone was still warm in her hand when she reached the corner, and for a moment she looked at the screen, not because she was waiting for him to call, but because she was no longer afraid if he did not. That small difference felt enormous. Across the street, a bus sighed to a stop, doors folding open with a mechanical exhale, and Elena watched people step on and off as if they were all simply passing through their own separate storms. She thought of the lawyer she was about to meet, a woman with silver-rimmed glasses and a voice as even as still water. Their conversation would not be glamorous. There would be no grand speech, no cinematic confession. Just facts. Just papers. Just a clean line being drawn where chaos had lived for too long. Elena had spent years translating Derek's moods, his silences, his compliments that came wrapped in correction. She had learned how to shrink herself to fit the shape of his comfort. Tonight, she was learning the opposite. At the office building on Mercer Street, the lobby lights glowed softly above polished stone floors and a row of quiet elevators. The security guard nodded as she came in, and the ordinary courtesy of it almost undid her. No suspicion, no smirk, no one trying to guess what kind of woman she was supposed to be. Just a door opening when she approached it. She crossed the lobby to the elevator and watched her reflection in the mirrored doors as they slid shut. For a brief second, she saw the version of herself Derek had preferred. Careful, uncertain, always waiting to be corrected. Then the doors sealed, and that woman was gone. Upstairs, the law office felt warm and hushed, all soft lamps and framed degrees, and the faint scent of paper and coffee. The lawyer stood when Elena entered, offered a firm handshake, and gestured toward a chair across from her desk. "I read your messages," she said gently. "We can take this one step at a time." Elena nodded once and sat down, setting her phone beside her in a deliberate little motion that said more than any speech could have. Outside the window, the city kept moving, indifferent and bright. Inside, for the first time in years, she could hear her own thoughts without Derek speaking over them. She was not here to argue. She was not here to prove anything. She was here to build a door he could no longer walk through. And somewhere back at the cafe, he was probably still waiting for the old version of her to answer. He did not know yet that she had already left him standing in his own silence. For the first time in a long time, Elena did not hurry home from the law office as if she were escaping something. She took her time on the ride back, watching the city slide past the glass in muted bands of light and rain, each block blurring into the next like a life she no longer had to explain. The cab smelled faintly of old leather and clean heat. Her phone stayed dark in her lap. No messages, no calls, no Derek pressing at the edges of her evening, demanding a response, demanding attention, demanding the emotional labor she had once given so freely that it had become the shape of her days. When she stepped into her apartment, the silence felt almost ceremonial. She set her keys in the bowl by the door, took off her coat, and stood for a moment in the dim entryway, as if listening for an old version of herself to speak. Nothing came, only the soft hum of the refrigerator, the distant murmur of traffic, and the steady beat of her own breathing. In the kitchen, she filled a kettle and placed it on the stove, then moved with quiet purpose through the small, orderly space. There was no dramatic music to her evening, no sudden revelation, only the fragile dignity of ordinary acts done without fear. She opened the cabinet above the sink and stared at the clean white mugs, the one with the tiny chip on the rim, the one she had kept because it was always the one Derek reached for. She took that mug out, held it for a second, then set it back down and chose another. It was such a small decision, almost invisible to anyone else, but to Elena it felt like a door closing softly, firmly, behind her. On the counter, her phone lit once with a name she had not seen in nearly 2 years. Derek. She did not move at once. The screen glowed against the marble beside the kettle, patient and insistent. One vibration, then another. She looked at it the way one might look at bad weather through a window, aware of its presence, but no longer willing to step outside into it. The kettle began to whistle. Elena turned off the stove, poured the water into her mug, and watched the steam rise in a thin, silver ribbon. Only then did she pick up the phone. Derek had sent a single message. "We need to talk." No greeting, no apology, no acknowledgement of the months, the damage, the quiet she had built around herself like a fence. Her thumb rested above the screen, motionless. She could almost hear his voice behind the words, careful and controlled, as if he were still entitled to direct the temperature of her life. Once, that message would have tightened her chest. Once, it would have sent her to the mirror, checking her face, rehearsing the right answer, the softer answer, the answer that would keep the peace. Now, she felt only a calm, level stillness. She set the phone face down on the counter and wrapped both hands around the warm mug. The city glowed beyond her windows. Somewhere out there, Derek was probably waiting for the familiar version of Elena to appear, to soften, to explain, to make herself smaller so he could feel larger. But that woman had already stepped out of the room, leaving him with the silence he had never learned to respect. By the fourth morning, Elena no longer woke with the reflexive dread that had once lived in her chest like a second heartbeat. She woke to a pale stripe of winter light across her kitchen wall, to the soft hiss of the kettle, to the quiet shape of her own life arranged around her in a way that finally felt earned. The apartment was small, but it was hers. The table by the window held a stack of legal pads, a bowl of green apples, and a single vase with one white lily opening slowly toward the sun. Nothing in the room asked permission. Nothing in the room apologized for taking up space. When her phone lit up, she did not reach for it at once. She let it glow on the counter while she poured coffee into a ceramic mug and stood there in her robe, watching steam curl upward in the morning air. The screen showed one new message from Derek, then another. "We need to talk. Please do not ignore me." The familiar insistence of it would have once felt like pressure against her ribs, a hand at the back of her neck guiding her toward the old pattern of answering, softening, explaining, yielding. But now the messages looked smaller than they had any right to. They were only words, black letters on a bright screen. Her silence had begun to make them harmless. She took her coffee to the window and looked out over the avenue below, where buses moved through slush and office workers hurried under dark coats, heads down against the cold. Across the street, a florist was opening its awning, and for a moment she found herself watching the woman inside arrange pale roses in a glass bucket, each stem cut clean, each bloom placed with care. It struck Elena, unexpectedly, that rebuilding a life was a lot like that. Nothing dramatic, no applause, just a steady choice to keep arranging what was still beautiful after everything that had been broken. She set the mug down, unlocked her phone, and read the newest message without feeling the old pulse of fear. Derek had sent a time, a place, and a line that was meant to sound reasonable. Lunch. The atrium on Mercer. Just the two of us. There was always a trick inside his calm voice. There was always a small hook hidden in the politeness. Once, she would have spent an hour trying to decode it, trying to guess which version of him would be waiting across the table. Now, she saw only a man who had mistaken her silence for vacancy. She typed one word, "No," then she erased it. She did not owe him the drama he still seemed to crave. She did not owe him even that much energy. Instead, she placed the phone beside the sink and washed her cup slowly, letting hot water run over her hands. The rhythm steadied her. The city moved outside the glass. The morning deepened. Somewhere, Derek would be staring at his screen, waiting for the version of Elena who used to rush to repair every fracture he caused. He would not understand why she was not reaching back, why the old lever no longer worked. But she understood. Gray rocking was not about punishing him. It was about removing the rope he had always used to pull her into his storms. It was about refusing to become the audience for his little performances. And in that refusal, something in her posture changed. Her shoulders settled. Her breathing stayed even. Her face in the dark reflection of the window looked calmer than she remembered ever feeling in his presence. By the time she grabbed her coat and stepped into the elevator, she was no longer thinking about what he wanted to say. She was thinking about the afternoon meeting at the law office, the contract she needed to review, the client file waiting on her desk, the dinner she might make for herself if she got home early enough. Small things, ordinary things, but they belonged to her now. That was the real power in the silence. Not emptiness, not fear, control. And Derek, whether he understood it yet or not, had just lost access to the version of her that he could still bend. The next morning, Elena arrived at the law office before the rest of the building had fully woken. The lobby still smelled faintly of polish and fresh coffee, and the elevator doors opened on a hallway washed in pale light. She walked past the glass conference rooms with a leather portfolio tucked under one arm, her heels making a quiet, steady sound against the stone floor. No hurry, no hesitation. It was a small thing, but it still felt new. For too long, she had entered every room as if she expected to be corrected, interrupted, diminished. Now she moved with the measured calm of someone who had stopped apologizing for taking up space. Derek had texted twice before noon. The first message had been a casual question about whether she still had his charger. The second had come 20 minutes later, a little less casual, asking if she was ignoring him on purpose. She did not answer either one. She let the screen go dark and returned to the stack of client notes on her desk. That silence, she was beginning to understand, had a shape. It had weight. It could sit between a person and the version of her they had once been able to manipulate. By lunch, she had revised a lease agreement, outlined a settlement memo, and finally remembered to eat the salad she had packed. Outside the office windows, The city moved in clean, in different lines of traffic and light. Inside, her phone lit up again. Derek. This time he called. She looked at the screen for one brief second, then turned it face down beside her notebook and kept reading. The old Elena would have felt the pull immediately. She would have wondered what tone he was using, whether he was angry, whether she had done something wrong, whether she should call him back before the silence made him feel abandoned. But that reflex had started to loosen, thread by thread, like a knot worked open by patience. Now, when his name appeared, she felt something else entirely. Not fear, not guilt, just distance. Around 3 o'clock, when the office had grown quiet and the afternoon sunlight had turned the conference room windows into sheets of gold, her supervisor stopped by with a file and a look of approval that still surprised her. He asked if she could take the lead on a client review next week. Elena accepted without rushing to downplay herself. Her voice stayed even. Her hands did not shake. And when he nodded and moved on, she sat for a moment looking at the page in front of her as if it belonged to a life she had once only imagined from far away. By the time she left for the evening, the message from Derek was still waiting on her screen, unsent and unanswered in the only way that mattered. He had written, "Come over. We need to talk." There was a time when those 4 words would have rearranged her whole evening, her mood, her breathing. Tonight, they meant nothing more than an old habit dressed up as urgency. She slipped the phone into her bag, stepped out into the cold air, and kept walking. The sky over the avenue was deepening into blue, and the glass towers caught the last light like sharpened silver. Elena drew her coat tighter, but not from fear. The air had grown colder, yes, but she was no longer standing still long enough to feel it. Somewhere behind her, Derek was still trying to pull a reaction out of the woman he had trained to respond. He would not find her there anymore. She was already on her way to a life that did not ask permission. By Friday, Elena had stopped measuring her days by Derek's moods. The law office gave her something his apartment never had: structure, air, and a door that belonged only to her. She came in early, left on her own terms, and learned the quiet rhythm of a life that did not bend around another person's expectations. The old version of her would have been checking her phone between every task, listening for a message that might turn her entire evening upside down. This week, the phone stayed dark in her bag while she reviewed contracts, marked corrections, and poured herself a second cup of coffee without asking permission from anyone. Even that small motion felt like a private declaration. At the copier, she watched the pages slide through with a soft mechanical hum, the smell of warm paper and toner filling the narrow room. It was ordinary. It was almost boring. And it was exactly what peace looked like when it finally arrived without making a scene. Across town, Derek was already becoming a familiar ache she no longer fed. His messages had shifted from sharp to careful, then to vague. First came the demand, then the apology, then the silence dressed up as patience. Elena recognized the pattern now. He wanted to feel her pulling away, because even negative attention was still a kind of control. But she had learned the difference between a door left open and a door finally locked. So when his name appeared again on her screen that afternoon, she did not flinch. She read it once. Then she set the phone face down beside her legal pad and kept working. Marisol noticed the change before Elena said a word. She noticed the steadier shoulders, the way Elena no longer looked over her shoulder when someone passed behind her desk, the way she smiled without apologizing for taking up space. "You seem lighter," Marisol said, sliding a folder across the table. Elena glanced up, thinking of all the years she had mistaken exhaustion for loyalty. "I think I am," she answered, and the words surprised her with their simplicity. The truth was, she had not become colder. She had become harder to move. That was the part Derek could never understand. She was not withdrawing to punish him. She was withdrawing to save herself from the exhausting work of explaining her boundaries to a man who only respected her when she was impossible to read. By the time evening settled over the city, the windows in the office had gone dark one by one, reflecting Elena back at herself in fractured pieces. She looked tired, yes, but not broken, not waiting, not reachable in the old way. She gathered her things, tucked the folder under her arm, and paused at the elevator doors as they opened with a soft chime. In the reflection on the brushed steel, she caught a glimpse of the woman she was becoming, calm, careful, and entirely her own. Derek could keep sending messages into the void. He could keep mistaking silence for weakness. Elena had already learned its real language, and in that language, she was no longer available. By Saturday evening, Elena had learned something quiet and dangerous. Silence did not end the conversation. It changed its shape. At the law office, she moved through the glass-walled corridors with a calm that had once felt impossible, a leather portfolio tucked under her arm, her heels striking the polished floor in a measured rhythm that no longer asked anyone to make room for her. She had spent the week rebuilding herself in small, practical ways. A stronger signature, a steadier voice, a coffee ordered without apology. And with every ordinary choice, something in her chest had loosened, as if a lock she had carried for years was slowly giving way. Derek noticed. Of course he noticed. Men like him always noticed when the air stopped bending around them. He began calling at odd hours, then sending messages that tried to sound casual and failed. Come by tonight. We should talk. You are taking this farther than it needs to go. Elena read each one with the same expression she wore when reviewing a difficult contract. Flat, unmoved, not because she had nothing to say, but because she no longer owed him the right to hear it. The real invitation arrived after lunch, slipped under her office door in a cream-colored envelope that felt heavier than paper should. A charity gala. Black tie. Saturday night. His name at the bottom, printed with the kind of confidence that once would have made her stomach tighten. She stood by the window for a long moment, the envelope resting in her hand while the city moved below her in silver cars and winter light. She almost smiled, not because she wanted to go back into his world, but because he still believed every silence was temporary. That was the mistake men like Derek made. They mistook restraint for surrender. He was probably imagining her standing in front of a mirror, wondering what version of herself would be acceptable enough to bring into his evening. The woman who would have softened her edges. The woman who would have tried to keep the peace. The woman who had once made herself smaller just so he could feel important. But that woman was gone now, and the office light reflected in the glass showed Elena only as she was, composed, alert, and no longer available for that old performance. She folded the invitation once, then placed it in her desk drawer beside a neatly stacked file of documents she had spent the week preparing. Her face remained still, but her pulse had begun to move with purpose. If Derek wanted her present, then he would get a version of Elena he did not recognize. Not loud, not pleading, just undeniably there. In the days that followed, she chose her clothes with the same care she brought to her work, not to impress anyone, but to remind herself that she still belonged to her own life. A charcoal dress with clean lines, a pair of pearl earrings she had not worn in years, a coat that fit her shoulders properly, as if it had been waiting for the woman inside it to arrive. On the night of the gala, she did not rush. She stood near the mirror by the apartment door, one hand resting briefly at her waist as she studied the stranger and the familiar woman layered together in the reflection. Her breathing was even. Her gaze was steady. Somewhere deep in the city, Derek was likely already practicing a smile for the crowd, ready to perform control in a room full of witnesses. He still believed he was inviting a quiet woman into a loud room. He had no idea he was inviting in the beginning of his own undoing. By the time the gala doors opened fully, Elena had already learned the room's first rule. People noticed what sparkled, then decided what it meant. Crystal light drifted across the ballroom in soft sheets, settling on polished tables, pale florals, and the careful shine of expensive shoes. Voices rose and fell in a polite hum, the kind that sounded calm only because everyone inside was rehearsing their own importance. Elena stood just inside the entrance with her posture straight and her expression composed, a charcoal dress tracing clean lines down her frame, pearl earrings catching the light whenever she turned her head. She did not scan the room like someone looking for approval. She moved as if she had every right to be there, because tonight, she did. Across the ballroom, Derek saw her. The change in his face was small at first, just a hesitation at the corner of his mouth, but it was enough to shift the air around him. He had arrived in the center of a conversation, hand raised slightly, as if he were still the man everyone turned toward. Beside him, his fiancée wore a bright smile that never quite reached her eyes. Derek's gaze fixed on Elena as though he could not decide whether to dismiss her or remember her. Elena gave him neither mercy nor anger. She offered only a calm, unreadable look and let the silence do what it did best. It did not explain itself. It did not apologize. It simply stood there between them, steady as stone. She accepted a champagne flute from a passing server, though she did not drink. The glass was cool against her fingers. The room kept moving around her, but she felt the subtle change in its rhythm. Conversations thinned. Heads turned. A woman near the bar leaned toward her companion and whispered behind a lifted hand. Derek noticed that too, and his jaw tightened. He walked toward her with the forced ease of a man who believed he still controlled the scene. "Elena," he said, drawing her name out as if it belonged to him. She met his eyes, and that alone seemed to unsettle him more than any sharp reply could have. "You came." The words carried a faint disbelief, almost a test. Elena's lips curved into something that was not quite a smile. She had spent too long answering his tests. Not anymore. Before she could speak, another voice joined them, smooth and polished, carrying the quiet confidence of someone used to entering a room without asking permission. "There you are." The man at Elena's side was tall, composed, and dressed with the kind of understated elegance that cost more than it announced. He did not crowd her. He simply stood close enough that his presence changed the temperature of the space. Derek's attention shifted, slow and suspicious. The man extended a hand, not to Derek, but to Elena. She placed her hand in his without hesitation. It was a small movement, almost nothing at all, and yet the effect was immediate. Derek went still. "Derek," Elena said at last, her voice level and unhurried. "This is Daniel Reed." The name landed softly, but the room seemed to hear it anyway. One of Derek's business partners looked up from the bar. Another man near the center table froze with his drink halfway to his lips. Elena continued, still calm, still measured. "Daniel is the one who approved the acquisition of your department last month." For a moment, nobody spoke. Even the music seemed to fall back, leaving only the low shimmer of stunned silence. Derek's face lost color in slow stages, as if each word had taken something from him. Daniel did not gloat. He did not smirk. He simply rested his hand lightly at the small of Elena's back, a gesture so natural it made the entire scene feel more final than any confrontation could have. "It is a pleasure to meet you," he said, and there was no warmth in the words, only courtesy. Derek blinked, looking from Daniel to Elena and back again, as if the room had rearranged itself while he was not watching. The woman at his side had gone rigid, her smile thinning into something brittle. Around them, whispers spread in quick, delicate bursts. Elena felt none of the old panic rise in her chest. No need to defend. No need to explain. She had entered the room quiet, and now the truth was standing beside her in a tailored suit, calm as a closing door. Daniel lifted Elena's hand and brushed a light kiss over her knuckles, not for show, but with the easy certainty of a man who knew exactly what he was claiming. Derek stared as if he had been struck by the simplest thing in the world, the fact that she was no longer reachable. And Elena, for her part, only looked at him with the same stillness she had practiced in the mirror all week. Not cold, not cruel, just complete. By the time the last guests began drifting toward the terrace for dessert and coffee, Elena no longer felt the room pressing in on her. The first shock had passed. The second had settled. What remained was something steadier, something that looked almost like grace from a distance, though she knew it had been built from weeks of choosing not to answer the bait, not to reopen the wound, not to hand Derek even one more piece of herself. At the far end of the ballroom, the strings had softened into a low, glassy hum. Waiters moved between tables with silver trays, their steps measured and quiet. The chandeliers still burned overhead, but their brilliance had changed now. It no longer felt like a stage light finding her. It felt like a room simply telling the truth about what had been there all along. Derek had retreated into a circle of people who were trying very hard to pretend they had not just watched him lose control. The woman beside him kept checking Elena, then Daniel, then the floor, as if embarrassment might become a hidden exit if she looked long enough. Derek, for his part, wore the strained smile of a man who had built his pride on being observed. Now every eye that landed on him seemed to carry a different weight. He had come here expecting the old version of Elena, the one who folded herself smaller so other people could stay comfortable. Instead, he was staring at a woman who no longer required permission to stand straight. Daniel guided Elena toward a quieter corner near the terrace doors, where the night air was cool against the warmth of the ballroom. Through the tall glass, The city glowed in soft layers of white and gold. He offered her a glass of sparkling water, then waited, patient as ever, as if he understood that the real victory was not the attention in the room but the stillness she felt inside it. Elena looked at the city lights and then back at the man beside her. There had been a time when she measured herself by who could make her nervous, who could make her explain, who could pull a reaction out of her like a confession. That version of her had lived in a constant state of defense, always bracing, always shrinking. Tonight, nothing in Derek's face reached her. Not his disbelief, not his resentment, not even the fragile anger that kept flashing behind his eyes whenever he saw Daniel's hand rest lightly at the small of her back. The most powerful thing in the room was not the gaze of the crowd. It was the fact that Elena no longer needed to perform survival for anyone. Daniel leaned slightly closer and said, in a voice low enough to feel private even in the middle of the noise, "You are free now." Elena let the words settle where old fear used to live. They did not sound dramatic. They sounded like relief. Behind them, somewhere near the center of the ballroom, Derek laughed too loudly at something no one found funny, trying to reclaim the shape of the evening by force of habit. But the sound fell flat, swallowed by the velvet murmur of the room and the soft chime of crystal against glass. Elena did not turn around. She did not need to. She already understood the final lesson of the night. Silence had not made her invisible. It had made her unreachable. And in that quiet distance, she had become more dangerous to his control than anger ever could have made her. When the music began again, Daniel offered his hand. Elena took it without hesitation, not as a woman being rescued, not as someone waiting to be chosen, as herself. And as they moved together beneath the light, calm and unhurried, the room finally seemed to understand what Derek never had. She had not lost anything by letting go. She had only stopped carrying what was never hers to keep.